You're listening to the Pithy Chronicle. History with a bite. I'm Caroline.
And I'm Erica. And we bring you history's dirtiest deeds, dripping with sarcasm.
Are you hungry yet? Hey there, Pithy listeners. We are so excited to present this week the greatest explorers of all time.
And if you hear me hacking in the background, I am recovering from a sickness. I will try to use my airport voice, which is what I call this, so that everyone has a pleasant listening/lying
I'm
experience.
intrigued that you call it an airport voice, because today we're going on some adventures, although only one of them involves airplanes.
Okay.
Top 5 explorers was hard because there have been so many, and so many of them have been such assholes.
Yeah. Can you do top asshole explorers? So
I tried to do top 5 most interesting to me and don't make me want to barf explorers.
That's a tall order.
It is a tall order. And we are going to go in chronological order for my top 5.
Okay.
Starting with Marco Polo.
Yes.
Which really seemed appropriate. Marco Polo lived... Marco
Polo
lived from circa...
Oh, God, a circa baby.
He's a circa baby from 1254 to 1324. He was a Venetian merchant, explorer, and a writer. He traveled through Asia along the Silk Road from 1271 until 1295.
Ooh.
24 years of travels. Pretty cool. And then he wrote about it in The Travels of Marco Polo. And the book is more interesting than the title.
Just think about being on the road for 24 years. And don't get me wrong, as a milspouse, we do get, to an extent, this constant travel.
Yeah.
But can you imagine hotel living for 24 years?
He actually worked for Kublai Khan as emissary and an ambassador. And so I think he had more of a home base in China. But he did see so much of the world. And he wrote it all down when he got back. Or actually, he dictated it to a fellow inmate in prison.
Oh, okay.
But he wrote about the wealthy and enormous Mongol Empire, talked about China and the Yuan dynasty, and he dipped into Persia, India, and Japan, and many other places as well. So, how did this Venetian merchant end up there? Well, when he was 15 years old, he met his dad, because his dad returned from his own ridiculously long travels to the east.
My goodness, is this just the Odyssey?
Marco had actually been in the womb when Dad and Uncle first left on their Silk Road travels. So he learned the mercantile trade from his father and uncle once they returned. And then they left again just 3 years later when Marco was 18, all three of them in 1271, 72. Now they're not traveling for fun. They're traveling to create associations with different merchants from around the world so that they can offer to their Venetian customers the best, the newest, the most, the exotic. They went along the Silk Road, and they were received at court by Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty and the 5th Mongol emperor of China. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan. Dad and Uncle had met him before, and he had actually asked them to return to Venice and bring back 100 ambassadors and priests from the Vatican to show him what this whole Christian faith was all about.
So, were they hostages or were they guests?
Well, we never found out because they all got wimpy and went back after a few weeks of travel. They were like, this is way too hard, way too dangerous. I'm not going over this vast wasteland of desert with you people on a camel. And they turned back.
It's not very evangelical of them.
It's not. So we don't know what Kublai Khan intended in the end, because uncle and father show up and they're like, hey, we're back. And we've brought Marco, our very intelligent son and nephew. And he's like, where are those priests? And they're like, oh yeah, bad news. That did not work out for us. But he did like Marco. He was impressed with his humor, his humility. Marco Polo spoke 4 languages and then easily adapted and learned more from there, so he was quite a linguist. He would then go on to serve as Khan's foreign emissary for a significant portion of his time abroad. He was sent on many diplomatic missions throughout the empire and Southeast Asia. He went to present-day Burma, India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and extensively through China. He lived in Kublai Khan's lands for 17 years, and he managed to stay in favor, which is kind of shocking. In 1291, the Polos were asked to accompany a Mongol princess, Kokochin, to Persia. And then 2 years later, they arrived. Oh. They left the princess with her new husband. And then they continued overland to Constantinople and then back to Venice. So in all, 24-year trip. He gets home. So exciting. Now go to jail.
Oh, did he fall in love with the princess? And
wouldn't that have been cool? But no, he didn't. I think he knew that that would be suicidal.
Well, he went to jail, so...
But he didn't go to Kublai Khan's jail. When he returned, Venice was at war with Genoa. And Marco joined with Venice, because he's a Venetian, and he was captured and imprisoned in Genoa. That's where he met his cellmate, Rustichello da Pisa, and he dictated his travels. The two of them released the book in 1299.
From prison?
Oh, he got out.
Oh, they got out. Okay.
When the war ended, they released the prisoners, and he went back to a very wealthy life as a merchant. He got married, he had 3 kids, and he basically moved to suburbia.
Oh.
He had this ridiculous half of his life where he was living it up and traveling the world.
Hanging out with princesses.
Hanging out with Mongol emperors.
What a carpool.
And then that was it. He died in 1324. And he was not the first European to reach China, but he was the first to really talk about what happened and leave such a detailed chronicle. It gave the Europeans such a clear picture of the East's geography, which they were kind of unsure about, as well as their customs. Europe was really unaware of the Mongol Empire and the court. He was the first to talk about porcelain, gunpowder, paper money, and a ton of different Asian plants and animals. And it was actually his travels that inspired Christopher Columbus, along with many other explorers.
Ooh.
The real question about Marco Polo, was it accurate? And
are you gonna tell me?
I'm gonna try, yeah. There are today 150 copies in various languages that exist, and they are all different. Often significantly.
Oh.
The oldest surviving manuscript we have is in Old French with a lot of Italian spattered in. And today's editions, like the one that's currently on my bookshelf, have been created through a blend of these multiple versions from multiple languages.
Okay, I see.
The memoirs were dictated orally, and it's thought that perhaps he originally didn't intend it to be this outlandish book that everyone would be like, really? That's what they do over there? But more meant to be a handbook for merchants with weights and measures and distances and coinage. Like, it makes sense. It would be kind of useful.
Yeah, it's like your pocket travel guide.
But as things were dictated and then translated, a lot of things changed. Some historians believe that the cellmate might have glamorized Polo's accounts and added in some romantic and fantastical elements to make it appeal to the reader and, sell books. But some passages seem to be quite verbatim, technical and precise, but other passages are kind of leisurely and conversational, so perhaps one is Marco's dictation and one is the author's writing style. But at the time, it was received with a ton of disbelief. People were like, no. The Europeans refused to believe that anywhere but Europe could be this advanced. That tracks. But a Dominican friar that authored the Latin translation solemnly affirmed the truthfulness of the book. He really believed, and he saw Marco's book as a way for Eastern missionaries to get some information. Some have questioned whether Marco Polo actually made all the travels himself, or if he made an amalgamation between himself, his father, and his uncle. Perhaps they all went in different directions and then returned, and all became his story. But his accounts of China are far more accurate and detailed than any other traveler's account of the time. The story of the princess that he escorted from China to Persia to marry is confirmed by numerous other sources. And most historians truly believe, and I'm going with them, that this really did happen, that he went to all of these places. Okay, maybe this princess was more beautiful in the book than she was in real life, but like, get over it. People are like, well, why didn't he talk about the Great Wall of China, or tea, or Chinese characters, or chopsticks, or foot binding? And I really like some of these conspiracy theories, but generally there's a pretty good reason for most of his omissions. Like, for instance, the Great Wall of China at the time was not that big of a deal, and it wasn't where he was living. Tea, I do have questions. Why did he not mention tea? Maybe he thought it was gross and just decided not to put it in. And then foot binding, like we talked about in our episode about beauty, he just wasn't...
He wasn't there to
with
talk
the
about
women
the feet.
in their home. He did talk about a lot of other things, and he clearly had a very good understanding of the culture and the language.
Mm-hmm.
On his deathbed, he gave a confession.
Oh, tell me.
I told only half of the things that I saw.
Which means he left out the good parts. The salacious parts.
Maybe he left out tea and chopsticks.
And foot binding.
There just wasn't space to write it all down. It has been estimated that he traveled nearly 15,000 miles if he did in fact go all of the places in the book. And I'm going to say he did. But our next explorer, Ibn Battuta, he supposedly in his lifetime traveled more than 73,000 miles.
Ooh, okay, so tell me more about this guy.
This dude is literally the most traveled explorer of all time. Pre-modern history.
Really? Like that?
Unless there's someone we don't know about from a time period before. And he went on foot for almost all of this. 1302 to 1368, he was a Berber Maghrebi scholar and explorer. Berber is an ethnic group indigenous to North Africa, and Maghrebi is a modern Arabic term for Westerner.
So a North African
Westerner explorer. He was Muslim, and he traveled mostly through the Muslim world as well as Afro-Eurasia. He spent over 30 years traveling. He visited most of Eurasia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, China, and the Iberian Peninsula.
Okay.
And he dictated his journey when he got home at the end of it. A gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling. And I have to say, it's a far better title than The Travels of Marco Polo.
But more verbose.
Which is fitting for this dude. Ibn Battuta literally means son of the duckling.
Oh, that's cute.
He has a super long full name. It's many, many, many names. We're going to call him Ibn Battuta.
All right.
And he was born into a family of Islamic legal scholars in modern Tangier, Morocco. He studied at an Islamic jurisprudence school, a very common education in North Africa at the time for the wealthier, and his family was a family of Islamic judges, and he would become an Islamic judge, so he would judge based on religious law. His travels actually began as a pilgrimage, and I have a quote.
Ooh.
I set out alone, having neither fellow traveler in whose companionship I might find cheer, nor caravan whose part I might join. So I braced my resolution to quit my dear ones, female and male, and forsook my home as birds forsake their nests. My parents being yet in the bonds of life, it weighed sorely upon me to part from them, and both they and I were afflicted with sorrow at this separation.
That's pretty sweet, though.
And he embarked in 1325. So he was 23 years old, and he pilgrimaged to Mecca, and he intended to be gone for 16 months. He was actually gone for almost 24 years. And then he'll take another quick trip.
Another quick trip?
Another 6-year trip. But this first one, he traveled over land following the North African coast, and eventually he joined up with the caravan to reduce the risk of being robbed.
Yeah.
He had his first marriage in the town of Sfax, but he soon left after a dispute with her father. He would go on to have many more marriages. That would be
so
like...
he is really like one in every port. Like
he would get someplace and stay for a couple of years. He's a little bit different than Marco Polo. He was more of a nomad. He'd get there and hang out, find a wife, sometimes find a job as an Islamic judge or as a translator or as an ambassador. And then he'd
Keep going.
get bored and he'd move on. Of the various routes to Mecca, this man chose the least traveled. He decided to journey up the Nile. He compiled a lot of prophecies about himself as he went, saying that he would be a great traveler, that he would go to Mecca via Syria.
Yeah, are they self-fulfilling?
Probably. Feels very convenient that all these things happened to him before they happened to him. He went to Hebron, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Ramadan, Medina, and then finally to Mecca. So he gets there. I've done this, but I should keep going. And he says he was driven by a dream in which a large bird took him in flight toward the east and left him there. So then, what's next? Iraq and Iran via the Arabian Peninsula. That's when he decided, I'm going to be a full-time traveler. From 1325 to 1332, he traveled to Mecca, Iraq, Iran, Arabia, Somalia, and the Swahili coast. From 1332 to 1347, he traveled all of Anatolia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and China. And from 1349 to 1354, he made his return via Spain, North Africa, Mali, and even Timbuktu.
And Timbuktu, too.
Literally. He traveled by sea, camel, caravan, and foot. He went to more than 40 modern-day nations.
Right.
He had a few notable moments.
Other than randomly leaving a wife?
Well, he did that like 10 times.
Oh my gosh.
Notably, he developed a terrible fever very early in his journey, and he literally tied himself to his saddle to avoid falling off and collapsing and being left by the caravan for dead.
I would have gone home.
He was married at least 10 times, all in different locales. And then when he felt the call of the wind, bye. He studied Islamic law in Alexandria, Egypt.
So, how did Islamic law feel about that? That's not very...
I don't know. That was never discussed, and I would like to know how that was cool. And I think the answer was, it wasn't.
It wasn't.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Mm.
He took part in a number of Hajj in Mecca, I think 4 times.
Ooh.
He relied on his status as an Islamic scholar to win hospitality from locals. Often he would arrive and be like, oh, I am here. I am a famous Islamic scholar and judge. And then people would just
believe it
and give him stuff like clothing, horses, concubines, slaves. Because my first question was, how do you finance this?
That did come up for me too.
I'm a girl that likes to travel. How are you affording to live for 30 years on the road? And the answer was, he'd be like, I'm important. You guys should be thankful I'm here. Give me stuff.
That is exactly what I'm going to try next time I go.
I'm important. Give me stuff.
We'll report back on how that went.
He was welcomed to the domain of the Golden Horde Khan, Uzbeg. He even accompanied one of the Khan's wives to Constantinople. He received there an audience with the Turkish emperor. In Delhi, in 1334, he worked as a judge under a powerful Islamic sultan. And there he married, again, and fathered children, and made buku bucks. In 1342, the Sultan selected him as an envoy to the Mongol court of China. It was a very dangerous journey. He was harassed by Hindu rebels. He was kidnapped, robbed of everything but his pants, and then lost in a terrible storm most of his ships and men. So he went to the Maldives.
Oh, too bad, so sad.
Where he gorged on coconuts, took several more wives, and acted as an Islamic judge for 4 flippin' years. But eventually he fell out with the rulers of the Maldives, probably for taking multiple wives and gorging on coconuts. And so then he was like, I guess I should go to China.
It's that time.
So supposedly he went, but a lot of historians are like, I don't think you actually went.
Ooh, tell me why.
He was supposed to go, did this 4-year vacation on the way because he was embarrassed, and got back and told the Sultan, oh yeah, I was there.
I was totally there.
I totally went there. But no one's really sure.
Okay.
Because a lot of his information is pretty scattered about China. It's not very detailed. Doesn't sound like he quite understood what he was talking about. So it's a little iffy.
Interesting.
And so he decided, time to go home. So he gets back to Morocco after 24 years. And he's like, well, my family's not here. I'm going to Spain. And he traveled all around there in North Africa. It's important to note that he did not keep any kind of journals. So all of the writings that he did about his travels came 30 plus years later, and he dictated all of it within about a year. But a lot of it seems to have been plagiarized from other travelers' earlier works.
Okay, so this guy, yes, he made a big trip, but he also just seems like a con man.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he?
Yes.
It's a really interesting glimpse into the life of a 14th century vagabond. It was very unusual at this time, just like with Marco Polo, to go so many places. Most people never left their hometown. And he probably went to most of them. Now, when he got there, did he con women into marrying him? Totally. I mean, he's no Christopher Columbus, but not great, no.
At least he didn't commit genocide.
Yeah, right. After he completed the book, he basically just vanishes. He likely worked as an Islamic judge, like he'd been educated to do, and telling everybody in the world that he was important for being. But we don't know. And then he died at some point. Next is Zhang He. Have you ever heard of Zhang He?
I have... No. I'm just gonna go
He was a Chinese mariner, explorer, diplomat, fleet admiral, and court eunuch of the Ming Dynasty. This dude led an interesting life. He was born to a Muslim family and had a really long history of serving the Mongol Empire. In 1381, the Ming army conquered Yunnan. His father died resisting this Ming conquest, and then he was captured by the Ming armies. A general was really angered by his refusal to give away any of the Mongol supporters in town, so this young boy was castrated and then taken prisoner.
Yeah, you don't grow that back.
You're not a starfish.
Well,
once he was castrated, it really meant that he was going to be a eunuch. But eunuchs were a very large part of the Chinese culture because eunuchs, not having the ability to impregnate women, were often allowed in places within the Chinese court that other men were not because they could be trusted.
Clearly they know nothing about female pleasure.
But yeah. I think the Chinese emperors did not bother with that nonsense because it was not really about the women.
No, heaven forbid.
Eunuchs had a very special place and often had a lot of political influence and power, as Zhang He eventually did. He was placed in the household of Zhu Di, a prince who eventually became the Yongle emperor. They lived right at the Mongol front, and they were holding off the Mongol tribes. And he spent his formative years as a soldier on this northern front with this prince. So when the prince became emperor by overthrowing his own nephew with the help of Zhang He, he took Zhang He with him.
Yeah, okay.
After the coup, he became the Grand Director and then Chief Envoy, so the highest of high posts. And after that, he becomes an explorer, the admiral of a fleet of treasure voyages.
Ooh.
There were 7 voyages, 317 ships with 28,000 crewmen. These treasure voyages took place from 1405 to 1433.
It's no destroyer, but that's,
It's impressive. It's big. The Yongle Emperor ordered the construction of this grand fleet, and it was meant to go and show the enormous wealth of China and the power of its navy. He put his most trusted advisor, Zhang He, at the front. 6 of the 7 voyages were done during this emperor's reign. And then when Zhang He returned from the 6th voyage, he learned that his emperor and friend and backer had died. And then his last voyage under a different emperor, but he just wasn't as interested
when
in it.
it's not your bro.
Yeah. The first 3 were to Calicut on India's Malabar coast. The 4th one was to Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. And the final 3 were the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa.
All of this makes me want to go on a vacation.
I'm here for you. It was a heavily militarized fleet. It has been suggested that the voyages were initially launched to actually capture his escaped predecessor and nephew from the overthrow. And that would actually make it the largest scale manhunt on water in the history of China and probably in the world.
Oh my.
Maybe originally they were going to look for this wayward nephew that had escaped from the coup. It carried tons of treasure to project this Chinese power and wealth to the known world. They gave out gifts to represent their wealth with gold, silver, porcelain, and silk, and they also brought back novelties like ostriches, zebras, camels, ivory, and giraffes. Don't buy ivory. There's my PSA. He brought back many foreign ambassadors whose rulers obligingly declared themselves tributaries to China. So this actually worked out quite well for the Chinese Empire. These exploits brought many new foreign nations into this tributary Chinese system, and it greatly increased the Chinese influence through military and political supremacy. He also engaged in a number of conflicts, which they won, because they had
317 ships
of guns and cannons and all those good things. Ships. He suppressed pirates, including one of the most feared pirate captains of the age. And he waged war on Ceylon, and then brought back their king as a captive and forced him to apologize to the emperor in person for the offenses against his naval mission.
Oh my.
And he was equipped. Of those 28,000 crewmen, they had navigators, explorers, sailors, doctors, workers, soldiers, translators, and diaryists, or historians. But he did prefer diplomacy, as one should. There is a legend that these huge ships carried hundreds of sailors on 4 decks and supposedly were twice as long as any wooden ship ever recorded.
We need to talk to Noah about that.
Yes. Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta both described these multi-masted ships of 1,000 passengers or more in their accounts. But, no one's really sure those could actually have worked physically, so how big were they? We don't know.
3 contemporary sources? That's, not nothing.
Not nothing. There is also some thought that he somehow reached North America before Columbus or Columbus's predecessors. But that is highly contested, so I just dipped my toe in and then backed up slowly. Now, what happened to him? Because he was quite hidden from history. The emperor, his patron, died, and the next emperor did allow him to take the 7th voyage, but he really wasn't thrilled with this tributary system. He actually viewed it as unnecessary to make all of these other nations kowtow to China, which I find fascinating.
Why?
It's expensive and it's frankly overtaxing for these far-off countries. Zhang He and his eunuch faction had once held a really heavy sway in the government, but when Zhang He died, his entire political party fell from power. The successive emperors tried to minimize his place in official accounts and history, and they definitely tried to get rid of this massive manhunt that began the voyages in the first place. They thought this was not a good look, PR-wise.
Right.
He likely died during the 7th expedition, but it's not actually mentioned in official dynastic histories because they tried to erase him.
Everything, yeah.
He played a very important role in the relationships between China and Islamic countries, being a Muslim himself. And he left behind mosques that he built during his travels. And he also spread the worship of Mazu, which is a Chinese goddess. But here are the debates. Where exactly did they go? In 2006, a prominent Chinese lawyer and a collector of artifacts unveiled an old map and claimed it proved that Europeans did not discover, quote-unquote, America, and were not the first to sail around the world. The map that he produced was drawn in 1763.
Very late.
Too late. But a note on it says that it was a reproduction of a map from 1418. Shows the world as a globe, not a flat plane. Sorry, flat earthers.
Not Mercator.
It renders all major continents with more exactitude than European maps did for another century at least. And scholars are reluctant, as I said. But the lawyer argues that the hesitancy is about changing history, not about the inadequacies or inaccuracies in the scholarship. The most notable claim, led by Gavin Menzies, a former British Navy submarine commander, argues that Zhang He traveled to America in 1421, 71 years before Columbus. There's extensive evidence, but it's widely disputed that he sailed to the coast of the U.S., today's U.S., and then actually left settlements along in South America. Argument is that the following regimes blocked out these dynastic histories and destroyed the records. And they claim that the Chinese emperors basically just changed their minds about connecting with the outside world and decided to cut it off. But if the map is genuine and actually dates to 1418, its longitudinal and latitudinal knowledge, shape of the world, as in it's round, these could not have come from European or other Asian sources at the time. So if it's legitimately from 1418, he went to America or the American continents before the Europeans.
Fascinating. I think he's my favorite so far.
I find him fascinating.
But I'm really hating that you're raining on my parade.
I am raining on your Zhang He parade. I want to believe it. I know it could have happened. Question is, did it? Captain James Cook, 1728 to 1779. We actually touched on him in our Hawaii episodes because that's where he dies. He was a British explorer, navigator, cartographer, and a captain in the British Royal Navy. He was the first recorded European to have contact with the eastern coast of Australia and with the Hawaiian Islands and with Easter Island. So we actually talked about him there too. I'd kind of forgotten that.
Ooh,
he was the first to circumnavigate New Zealand, and he had 3 very famous voyages to the Pacific. He was not born wealthy. He actually joined the British Merchant Navy as a teenager because he was quite poor and he had no formal schooling. Then he went into the Royal Navy after that and did see quite a bit of action in the 7 Years' War. During that time, he surveyed and mapped much of the Quebec area, and this was discovered and noted by the Admiralty.
Good at your job.
Since it was a time of British overseas exploration, he was eventually given command of the HMS Endeavour for these 3 Pacific voyages. He was married to a woman named Elizabeth Batts, the daughter of his mentor. They had 6 children, although
Lord.
when he found the time, I don't know. And when he wasn't at sea, he lived in London's East End. Unfortunately, he has no direct descendants because all of his 6 children died before having any children of their own. Captain Cook sailed thousands of miles across mostly uncharted areas of the globe, and he mapped from New Zealand to Hawaii. He was noted for his seamanship, his surveying, his cartographic skills, physical courage, and the ability to lead men into adverse conditions. Here are his 3 Pacific voyages that made him famous. Number 1. He was commissioned for a scientific voyage to the Pacific Ocean to observe and record the 1769 transit of Venus across the sun, helping to determine the distance of the Earth from the sun.
And was he successful?
No. No, sadly not.
I'm shocked.
He got 100 extra guineas for his trouble, though. They made the observation in Tahiti, but the results were not very conclusive or accurate, and so it didn't really help that much. But after they saw Venus, he then opened the secret mission orders.
Ooh.
He literally had a secret envelope.
Oh my gosh.
He was to search the South Pacific for Terra Australis. Australia. He sailed to New Zealand. He was the first European to communicate with the Maori. And then he went to Australia and traveled up the coast to map it out. And he did try to establish relations with the indigenous population. It didn't go well. Both in New Zealand and in Australia, he had a number of small scuffles.
Kerfuffles.
Scuffles or kerfuffles. So just to say, not everything was hunky-dory.
Right.
He did eventually run aground on the Great Barrier Reef. Surprise!
Whoops.
Well, he didn't know it was there. It took 7 weeks to repair the badly damaged ship. And during this time, he did actually have quite peaceful encounters with Australia's Aboriginal people. And then he returned to England 3 years later. His wife must have been like, I'm exhausted. Your turn for the 6 children.
That, or maybe she had taken up with somebody
look
else.
At you. Stirring up trouble. For his second voyage to the Pacific, he was commissioned by the Royal Society to search for hypothetical Terra Australis again, despite the fact that he had mapped its coastline and shown that it was of continental size. The Royal Society didn't believe it. And they were like, no, there's gotta be something else down there. So go find it. He and the HMS Resolution and a companion ship went. They circumnavigated the globe at the extreme south latitude, and they were one of the first ever to cross through the Antarctic Circle. But the 2 ships were eventually separated in the Antarctic fog, and on the return, he landed in the Friendly Islands, Easter Island, Norfolk Island, New Caledonia, and Vanuatu. And then he came home to put to rest the myth of Terra Australis. Sorry, it's just Australia. There's nothing else there.
There's nothing exciting. There's
Very
no
exciting,
loss.
but it's not another continent. It's just that one. The House of Lords dubbed him the first navigator in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
How the House of Lords of England could dub him something for all of Europe, I'm not sure, but you know, the Brits love to do that. He was then given a cushy retirement job that he didn't really like because he wanted to go back to sea. So, voyage number 3, which would be the death of him, literally. Publicly, this third voyage was to return a Tahitian guide back to his homeland. Secretly, it was another secret. It was a search for the Northwest Passage around the American continent. They were just desperate to find a way through the north. He dropped off the guide in Tahiti as planned, and then he turned north, becoming the first European to begin formal contact with the Hawaiian Islands. Cook named them the Sandwich Islands after the First Lord of the Admiralty, the Earl of Sandwich, but clearly that didn't stick.
No, and thank God it didn't.
He kind of saw Hawaii, named them, and then he kept going northeast along the western coast of North America, and he actually came into contact with the First Nations village of Yuquot in Nootka Sound, Canada. They had strained relations, but generally pretty cordial. He then explored and mapped all the way to the Bering Strait. And in a single visit, he charted most of the North American northwest coastline and helped establish where Russia ends and Alaska begins. So,
holy cow.
But unfortunately, his way was blocked by ice to the north, so then he sailed west to the Siberian coast and then down back to Hawaii, and he was like, oh, finally, a vacation in the sun.
Until
his arrival coincided with a harvest festival day, and so there's some belief that the Hawaiians might have thought he was Lono, the god, or sent by their god. But after a month's stay, tensions rose, and as we discussed in a different episode, a boat was stolen by a few Hawaiians. Cook's response was to attempt to kidnap and ransom the king. That didn't go over well. He was hit on the back of his head and then stabbed and then murdered. That is the end of Captain Cook.
Indeed it is. I don't think you come back from that.
No, there's no coming back from dead.
You don't get up from dead.
The last explorer I wanted to tell you guys about today is Roald Amundsen, who lived from 1872 to 1928, and he was a Norwegian polar explorer, both the south and the north. He began his career as a first mate on the Belgian Antarctic expedition, and then he did his own expedition to successfully traverse the Northwest Passage that Cook was looking for and did not find. And then in 1910, he set sail again for the South Pole and did eventually reach Antarctica. He was from a family of ship owners and captains, and his mother was like, please, God, don't do this. Please do something else.
I just want you to be home.
I really need you to be a doctor. So he went to school until literally the day his mother died, and then he immediately quit school and went to sea.
He was trying.
While his mom was alive. At 25, he went on his first expedition to Antarctica. But it was a very badly prepared expedition, and they almost all died because they weren't planning to winter there. They had to stay over the winter in Antarctica, which is not a great plan.
Yeah, you just don't go to Antarctica without preparation.
No, but they did. He himself says that the doctor on the crew actually saved everyone else from dying of scurvy because he hunted for animals and force-fed them fresh meat. Because evidently, uncooked meat, specifically offal, the intestines and things, have enough vitamins to prevent scurvy.
Well,
life hack.
There you go. If you're ever stuck in Antarctica.
Should you be stuck? Eat the offal.
Eat the offal.
Which will probably taste
awful.
The Northwest Passage was his second trip in 1903, and it was the first expedition to ever successfully traverse Canada's Northwest Passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. There were 6 men on a 45-ton fishing vessel. It had a shallow draft and only a 13 horsepower engine. I mean, it was like with paraffin. It was so tiny. Their technique was to hug the coast. They actually spent 2 winters doing this, so it was a 2-year trip just to get across basically the north of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, with a 13 horsepower engine.
It takes time. He and his crew only really survived because they met and learned from the local Inuits how to survive. They did not say, we are European and therefore we know better. They were like, oh, what are you guys wearing to survive here?
It's really cold.
It's really flipping cold, and we're not used to this. He watched and he learned an invaluable amount of information that helped him survive his Antarctic expeditions later. For example, he learned about sled dogs for transport. He learned to wear animal skins in lieu of heavy wool parkas because when they got wet, they didn't get dry.
Oh, it stinks
it's
to
awful.
you. Smells bad too.
Eventually, he did reach Nome on Alaska's Pacific coast. He got all the way across. But then unfortunately, he couldn't let anybody know that he'd done this amazing thing because the nearest telegraph station was 500 miles away. So he traveled there.
Well, you know, you have to
I gotta let people know. He went and wired a success message. Also, at that time, he learned that Norway and Sweden were no longer a combined country, and that he now had a new king. But,
whatever.
He's a survivor, took it in a stride. And then he went on a South Pole expedition. He originally wanted to go to the North Pole, and he got funding for the North Pole. And he told all of his backers and all of his crew they were going to the North Pole.
Yeah, I'm going to see Santa.
And then they left from Oslo, went to Madeira first, and that's when he tells everybody, just kidding, we're going to the Antarctic.
South Pole.
And he literally sent a telegram that said, beg to inform you, proceeding to Antarctic. Amundsen. This did not go over well eventually, but what could they do now?
Yeah, nothing.
6 months later, they arrive at the Great Ice Barrier where they established a base camp. And he really encouraged all of his crew to adopt this Inuit style of fur skins instead of heavy wool clothing. And that just shaped everything he did from there on, and he learned so much from them. He also learned from them that they should use these sled dogs, and he definitely planned to kill the dogs as they went as a source of fresh meat.
No.
I did not love this.
I don't love that.
He started with 52 dogs, and eventually he made it there with 16.
No.
Oh, I know. But he did manage to reach the South Pole using the sled dogs and their meat. On the 14th of December, they arrived just 1 month before another group of explorers, so they just clinched the title. And they left a tent and a letter stating their accomplishment in case they didn't return home safely. But they did, and they made their way to Hobart, Australia to telegraph again their success. Did it really happen? If nobody knows about it, must publish one success. After that, his career kind of turns bad. He had a lot of failures. He really wanted to continue exploring the Arctic and the Antarctic, and he hoped that it would yield more academic research than previous expeditions, but he just had disaster after disaster. The plan was to sail along the coast of Siberia and go further into the ice than others had done before, and then literally freeze the ship into the polar ice cap and drift toward the North Pole. But honestly, it just worked too well. The ship froze in ice too thick to break free. Amundsen then broke his arm. Then he was attacked by a polar bear, and eventually he decided, screw the ship, we're just gonna go on sled dogs. But unfortunately, it wasn't quite frozen enough in that area, so they couldn't cross the Bering Strait. After 2 winters frozen in the ice and having achieved nothing, he decided to go back to Alaska and repair his ship. At that point, his crew was kind of like, not so sure about this.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd be on board with that either.
No. They spent 1 more winter up there, frozen in the Bering Strait, desperately trying to just drift to the right spot to hit the North Pole. Didn't work. Then they went south, and Amundsen had to return to Norway because, he didn't have any more money. But he took with him 2 young indigenous girls, a 4-year-old whom he adopted, and her companion, which I don't quite understand.
Well, what 4-year-old has a companion?
I don't know, but this is very strange. I don't quite understand it, but he took these 2 girls back with him with the intention of adopting one of them and I guess helping the other one. But then when he went bankrupt 2 years later, he just sent them away to the companion's father who lived in Russia. So
very odd.
Very odd. He returned again in 1922, and he tried this time to do things by plane. If he can't freeze his way and drift to the North Pole, he'll fly over it. But he failed, and then he failed again, and then he failed again, and then he disappeared.
Oh, like lost at sea or lost in air?
Lost in the air, yeah. He was flying a rescue mission in the Arctic, along with 5 others, trying to rescue some missing members of another flight crew that had crashed while returning from the North Pole. And they never returned. They were never found, and the Norwegian government called off the search after 3 months.
Man.
And that's the unknown end to Roald Amundsen.
And also the end of the episode, isn't it?
It is.
Wow, what a note.
We've explored most of the world.
We've covered it.
You're welcome.
If you don't have the time and money yourself to go to all these places,
to circumnavigate the world, we have done it for you.
All from the comfort of our guest room.
I'm just going to say, that to be an explorer, you just gotta be cool with dying.
Cool with lying, too.
Lying, dying, discomfort.
It's not for me, dude.
No, but thank you for doing so. We learned so much.
And that, my friends, is that.
I'm Caroline.
And I'm Erica.
And we are Pithily Yours.
This episode is brought to you by the Pithy Chronicle, LLC. The Pithy Chronicle is intended for education, entertainment, and non-commercial purposes. Any views or opinions expressed in this podcast are personal and do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that the owner may or may not be associated with in a professional or personal capacity. While we offer lots of sarcasm, this podcast does not offer any advice or services. Listening to this podcast may induce fits of laughter, unexpected distraction, or uncontrollable rage at the subjects, hopefully not at us. We hope you learned something today. If not, so sorry. Please be advised we are not experts in the following fields: medical, legal, financial, technological, thermonuclear engineering, submarine warfare, neuroscience, or cat husbandry. Thanks for listening to our little disclaimer. Just covering our history-loving asses. Bye!